Okay, everybody, let's look at fighting the Second World War for just a second. And it's such a big and broad conflict that we can't get to all the ins and outs and the bits and pieces in a class like this. Matter of fact, I had a undergraduate course just on the war in the Pacific Theater way back in the 90s and had a graduate seminar on World War II, when I did my master's degree. And we still didn't cover everything. And so what I want to do is look at some selected episodes and engagements to kind of give you some understanding of what this conflict was about. And I got a few personal stories in here from for some family members who were there. Some background for just a second. And how does America get to the point it can close with and actually destroy the enemy? Because that's not going to be the easiest thing on December the 8th, 1941. So for the war. And that's during the time period of the previous two lectures. And that army is very small, and it's especially in light of the peace movements in the 20s. My grandfather Patterson joins the army during the Great Depression. I think part of it is to get away from some of the 11 other brothers and sisters that he had, and during the Great Depression. But you look at it, it's very small. And the equipment is outdated, grossly outdated in the 1930s. The artillery, the tanks, other things are just, they're not up to the par of the European militaries or even sometimes the Japanese. Well, what happens is, if FDR, being that internationalist, he is going to see in the late 1930s a need to prepare America for this war. And that move toward national defense is going to pay off in a big way after Pearl Harbor. And it's not immediate. It's going to take a little bit, but it does pay off. And one of the first things we look at when you look at the Pearl Harbor attack is, okay, they sank like 7 or 8 battleships. And we know that their Navy had been hamstrung by the Washington Naval Treaty and some relatively short-sighted spending. But one of the things that we have a number of battleships floating around, but we do have some advanced aircraft carriers in both oceans, and that's going to be a real key to this thing. The British have one or two. I mean, they have a few. The Japanese have they have what they call their Kido Butai, their strike force, which is like 6 of them. The Akagi and the Kaga and the Shokaku and the Zuikaku and the Soryu and the Hiryu. So they have those, but America has them as well. Most other countries do not. And Japan, it's going to renounce that treaty in the 30s, and the Germans, God, they built the Bismarck and the Tirpitz, which are humongous ships. America started the building boom, but it took time, and we had already designed our ships around this Washington Treaty limit of 35,000 tons, and there is a width limit on those ships. It's like 107 or 108 feet to be able to get through the Panama Canal, and it takes time to build a ship. The Army Air Corps, which is later going to be the Army Air Force, and in 1947 is going to become just the Air Force, finds itself with small fleets of planes, and they're woefully outdated. I mean, you've got some neat designs in the works, like the B-17 and the B-25 and some things like that, but again, it takes some time. And they found themselves in the late 1930s flush with money, and so they start to build these things and buy these things like the P-40 Warhawk and some of that. But again, it's going to be outmoded when you compare it to its Axis counterparts, okay? But what you see is like the P-38 and the P-47, they're starting to be designed now, and they're going to play a massive part later in the war. The ship you see here is USS North Carolina. Go down to Wilmington today, you can see it. I've shown you a color picture of it before. But it's laid down in 37. Its sister ship, the Washington's laid down at the same time. Then they start building the South Dakota class. I mean, so America's not sitting around on its haunches, but it takes a lot to get this thing done. And the military's getting geared up, but the infrastructure is simply not ready. So there's going to be, after Pearl Harbor, there's going to be defeats, and there's going to be dark times, and there's going to be some shortages until the American military machine, or that industrial machine, can be brought to bear. And when it does, there's nothing else like it in the world. Isoroku Yamamoto, who was the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and later the abortive Midway battle, said, supposedly told the Japanese high command that he could run wild for 6 months, and after that he had no real prospects for success. Now, did he say it? We're not real sure. It's possibly apocryphal, but that timeline's almost dead on. But it takes America a little time to get everything moving and going and working on the right direction here. actions. And it's a story, like I said, we know too well. For 6 months, the Axis powers are rolling America back everywhere. Now, of course, we're not over in Europe, but those deadgum submarines are sitting off our coast, can literally, pop up their periscopes, see major cities. Heck, there's one up in one of the Great Lakes, even, the submarines got that far. And so they're continually rolling back American outposts, sinking ships faster than we can build them. In the Philippines, old Douglas MacArthur, who we're going to see again and again in this class, gets himself hemmed in on the Bataan Peninsula and later on at Corregidor, and it falls to the Japanese. Defeat after defeat. You look out your window. If you were one of my favorite places to go is Oak Island, and if you had been in a house on Oak Island in 1942 in that spring, and you could have looked out there at night and saw ships burning from German submarines torpedoing them. The only real success that America has at that time, or visible success, there's a lot of success, we just don't see it as such at the time, is the Doolittle Raid, which has been immortalized in that new movie Midway, and even in that very bad Ben Affleck movie Pearl Harbor. So that is, it's a very audacious thing for America to do in the spring of 42, but it does bring a sense of, you know what, you punched us, we'll punch back. But in the meantime, the industrial underpinnings of America's war machine are starting to come to life. What happens is, in 1942, America does really want to get into the conflict. And if you remember Plan Dog and Rainbow Five or the Germany First strategy, FDR is going to insist that America be in land combat in the European theater of operations in 42. Winston Churchill wants no part of going across that channel. He's scared of what Hitler has built up as what we call his Fortress Europe, or Festung Europa. And so Churchill's all about a scheme. You would think he would learn from his Dardanelles foolishness during World War I, but he didn't. And so Churchill says, you know what, we need to attack in North Africa. He's called that the soft underbelly of Europe. If we attack in North Africa, you know what we can do? We can roll up Italy, come up through that way instead of having to attack the coast of France. Well, geez. Folks, it isn't soft, but it does provide the American military with some OJT, on-the-job training. And it's going to prove to be invaluable as we get into the rest of the Battle of Europe in 1944. There was amphibious operations there in Sicily and later on in Italy are going to demonstrate some problems and allow us to make corrections in how to do this amphibious stuff, which is kind of funny in seeing as how America's been doing that over in the Pacific at that point in time for months and really had that thing down to a science by the late 1943, but that's okay. These two theaters don't necessarily see eye to eye. So you'll notice we had a little arrow come in there, boom, drive through Algeria, Tunisia to Sicily, Sicily to Italy, and Italy up to Rome. But it's going to be June 5th, 1944, before the Allies take Rome. Now, something's going to happen on June 6th, 1944, that's going to take all the air out of that balloon. Well, over in the Pacific, we're going to have battles from the beginning, and they're going to be running battles. You look, their land masses are not huge with the exception of Australia, so we're going to have to be fighting island to island, and we're going to have a couple of different thrusts. Here, we're going to have one thrust through the Central Pacific and one up through the South. But the turning point in this going to be two little battles in the spring and summer of 42, one of them being the Battle of the Coral Sea, which you just saw on the map back there. And what happens is America figures out where the Japanese are going to be, and we have the first battle in history in which the navies could not see each other. And it's fought by aircraft, and we sink one of their light carriers. They sink our carrier, USS Lexington. But something happened. We lost a little more than they did, but it spooked the Japanese, and they stopped. Their planned invasion of Port Moresby and later on for Australia is stopped. We have stopped the Japanese right then by hook and by crook and by the hair of our chinny chin chins. So what happens? The Japanese become incredibly irate over the Doolittle Raid. And so Yamamoto decides that it's not the Army that needs to control this war, it's the Navy, and the Navy's going to do something about it. And it's going to end with the Battle of Midway, which is a movie this past year. Kind of a weird little movie, but most of the stuff in it's actually somewhat correct. And so what's going to happen is Edwin Layton is going to break the Japanese military code, and I've put on here, well, mostly. And he's right. It's right. It's mostly. And the movie does an incredible job of telling you how they do it, which I thought was one of the coolest aspects of it, even though my wife was like, Well, that's boring. No, 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 no. It's pretty cool. So when you know the combined fleet's coming and they're aiming for Midway, you know where they are. You know how to meet them. You can give it the ambush on them. And so Nimitz did that. He put his carriers in position to ambush the Japanese. And at the end of the day, the Japanese lost 4 carriers, the Akagi and the Kaga, and was it the Shokaku? Yeah, I think so. And one of the other, the Shiryu or one of those. Anyway, it doesn't matter. They lose 4 carriers. America lost one, the USS Yorktown, which was almost lost in the Coral Sea, but comes back and it finally is lost at Midway. But now four of the carriers are gone. They're done. The tide, the strength of the 2 navies is going to turn on that battle right there. So now that we stopped the Japanese at Coral Sea, we stopped the Japanese at Midway. Now it's time to turn them. So I can make the argument that Guadalcanal is a turning point. That they're in the Solomon Islands. My grandfather Patterson will be on the canal. My wife's uncle Dan, his Marine, was on the canal. And so now this time we're going to start rolling back this expansion. And the Japanese are constructing an airfield there. And that airfield is going to wreak havoc on our convoys, wreak havoc on our communications with Australia and New Zealand. And so what happens is the 1st Marine Division has been created. In August of 42, boom, a land on the canal, and it turns into an epicenter. This little island, this nickname was Green Hell, is going to be the focal point of everything. America's turning its might in the Pacific there. The Japanese are focusing their might in the Pacific there. And so what happens affects the level of intensity that we have. The Marines and later the soldiers are going to hang on by a thread. And both nations are going to pour more men and material into this battle than you can imagine. But what happens is by January, February 43, the Japanese are done. They cannot keep up with the losses that are getting inflicted by the Americans and the Australians. We don't need to forget them. Their losses in planes and pilots and ships are irreplaceable. The Japanese industrial machine cannot keep up with what the Americans are able to do. Walk down memory lane here is that once America turns the tide, now, okay, we've stopped them. Now we got to go drive them back, which means it's time to close with and then destroy the. And so what we need to do now is look at the lessons learned in the Mediterranean, or in the Med, as we might say, and we figure out how to wage modern mechanized warfare. North Africa, well, you can see here one word, Dieppe. And there's a picture of British and Canadians on the beach at Dieppe that have been killed. And that Dieppe parade in 42 showed us that the Germans will defend Europe to the last. So it's going to be hard to get back over there. Okay? But FDR still like, you know what? We got to get into ground combat in 42. Operation Torch. And it's designed to weaken those Axis powers in Europe and preparing for that cross-channel invasion. Now, this is way on down. And look at Spain. Remember, Spain is the one ally that we basically leave out in the cold because of the whole Spanish Civil War. So what happened? It was a mess. You have an army that is incomplete. Rick Atkinson has a trilogy of books that each one of them has won the Pulitzer Prize in history. And the first one is called An Army at Dawn. And it is about this time period. And there's a reason he wins the Pulitzer for it. Their training is incomplete. They're green. Their commanders have never handled large numbers of troops in battle. It's one of those where you kind of learn how to play war. It's kind of like a scrimmage, except the Germans aren't playing scrimmage. The Germans are playing for keeps. And at Kasserine Pass, which is in early February of 43, all of a sudden, old Erwin Rommel gets his hands on the Americans and they retreat in confusion. But what you see happening here is, in the Civil War, we call it the hardening. People that are poor leaders, that don't know what they're doing, that are relatively incompetent, they get kicked out. People that know what they're doing are put in their place. People that have shown they know what they're doing. And so from February until May, organized resistance is going to end because the Americans and the British are going to take it to the Germans. So there's old Erwin Rommel down on the right-hand corner. So, of course, you get rid of your crappy leaders. You don't want those. You get men with some serious combat experience. And that's going to become very important. It's not what do we think the fighting will be like. It's this is what the war looks like. We create some doctrine and some tactics that we're going to continue to use for good and for bad later on. And so lastly, to defeat that once vaunted Afrika Korps. from Erwin Rommel. I mean, Rommel's not there. He's back in Germany by that time, working on the Atlantic Wall. But now, not only have we stopped the Axis, we're beating them. It becomes, where do we go next? And again, it's just like I showed you in that one map. We're jumping across it into Sicily. Okay, so this is what the British want to do. We can't attack directly into France, so let's go somewhere else. Stalin, for his part, is begging for that second front. The Red Army has just gotten done with the Stalingrad campaign, and they are under some severe pressure. And so America, still kind of new to this war thing, we're going to follow that British lead, and we're going to go to Sicily. And it's going to be Operation Husky. And in July of 43, now we know a short year later when we're fighting in the hedgerow country of France, but we land, and it's the largest amphibious invasion of the war. I don't care what those D-Day guys say. Okay, you start looking at the number of ships and men. I mean, it's big. 37 days, overrun the island. So far we're doing. Where next? Let's go to Italy. September of 43. Whole time we're planning the invasion of France, but we're keeping the Germans bogged down here. Italy's going to, they bow out of the war, get rid of Mussolini, and so it has to be Germany that takes over the whole process. But when you begin to look at this, again, we're keeping German resources pinned down. We're figuring out how to do things. We're finding who our leaders are. We're finding out what doctrines work. It's a good, and that's kind of the so what. You know, the enemy was weakened. America gains that significant combat experience. We proved that the offensive was the way to win this war. And America's going to take it to the Germans, we're going to take it to the Japanese. There's some combat problems, and we develop answers to them. That's the doctrine and tactics. So what are some of those specific lessons that we learn? Terrain is the key. High ground is the key. You got to keep it or capture it, and you got to deny it to your enemy. And it takes a lot of hard fighting and a lot of casualties to do it. And that's going to be part of the problem. All right, so in order to do it with the least number of casualties, we got to have all the branches and the arms working together. That's armor or tanks, that's artillery, and it's infantry, and it's the Army Air Force. That's that combat punch that America's always been able to bring to bear, to throw a lot of lead and a lot of steel down range, and the enemy can't withstand it. Then they come up with a standard combat tactic of fire and maneuver, which is you lay down cover and fire. You can hear it in the movie Saving Private Ryan. Cover and fire, and then boom, 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 boom. That's to keep the enemy's head down, so you fire and move, fire and move. And number 5, this is incredible. The best units are capable of combat, continuous combat for only a short period of time. About 3 days. Anything after 3 days, they start to get much more inefficient. They're tired, they're worn out. And so the Army had to come up with a way to rotate units in order to create, in order to let the other ones freshen up and become combat effective again. So there's going to be some rotation, there's got to be a reserve. And anytime you can let soldiers be comfortable or avoid misery, makes them more effective. Subjecting them to it lowers morale and effectiveness, and the soldiers had a name for that, and they called it chicken shit. Now, that's chicken shit. I mean, I'm sorry for the language, but that's what they called it. Major problems. It's kind of hard to generate a large volume of small arms fire, even with the M1, which Patton called the greatest battle implement ever devised by man. A semi-automatic 30-06 popping out 7 rounds before you have to reload. But it's hard to acquire targets with infantry weapons. And some people don't like to shoot an enemy they couldn't see. And it took a long time for them to master the idea of volume of fire. The more lead you can put down range, the more you can keep their heads down and the more of them you can kill. And a lot of times, infantry commanders would not employ all the weapons at their disposal. And that's a part of a problem. They have mortars and assault guns and anti-tank guns, heavy machine guns, things like that are designed to support it. And it took a while for everybody to get on the same page. Then ineffective cooperation with the armor. I mean, it's strange that somebody decides to stick a field telephone on the back of a Sherman, and boom, you have one of the best advances in combined arms operations that you've ever seen. And so you start looking at this, there's some problems that have to be overcome, but eventually they are. Our enemy before we get too deep. Here's what the Germans figured out. The U.S. Army can take care of its business. and they become a worthy and a deadly opponent. And the German army is bleeding out over on the Eastern Front. And so the Germans are like, man, here comes America with an almost unlimited manpower supply. And I say that without hyperbole. America's going to put 14 million men under arms during this conflict and could have put 3 times that many without straining. That's Russian level armed forces right there. Where does our Mediterranean experience pay off? It pays off after D-Day, seen with the Bocage. And you look at that picture and it looks pretty cool, like a little hedge like you have out front of your house. That is not the hedge in front of your house. D-Day invasion is going to be part 1. Then you got to expand that foothold and you got to drive toward Germany. And one of those critical things is that the Wehrmacht was an incredible fighting force, and they're fighting on the defensive, which is hard. I mean, not hard. It's actually easier on you. It's hard to attack. And then they've got these excellent defensive positions with all these machine guns and artillery pieces. And this thing called a Nebelwerfer that sounds like a screaming meanie. And the initial invasion on June 6, 44 is an incredible success. I mean, unmitigated success. But it gets quickly bogged down in these hedgerows. One's the Germans. I mean, they're dang good at fighting on the defensive. And number 2 is the terrain itself. And so you see a cross section of the hedgerow right here. And you see it's 4 to 8 feet tall, 6 to 10 feet wide at the bottom. That is not the kind of shrubs I have at my house. And what happens is these things become little fortresses. It's half earth, it's half hedge. You see, you got 200 by 600, you got 100 yards. I mean, it's huge, okay? And so you get inside there, there's no logical pattern, no rhyme or reason. Things are a zillion years old. And if you're a defender, man, you can use this for concealment. You can use it for a natural defense. It restricts the observation of the Americans. It prevents heavy direct fire, which Americans love. And it limits the size of the combat units you can get into the operation. It's a mess. So you look at that Bocage. I mean, check out the Germans there up top in the air. And that's not it. Anyway, so on D+6, the Americans ran into this maze. And on D+6, just happens to be the day my grandfather Brown and my great uncle Wilbur came across Omaha Beach, walk into the Bocage. And by that point in time, 6 days in, about a week, and our advance is a crawl. And the whole thing ends up about a month behind the schedule that the Allies, that Schaeff had and Eisenhower had laid out. And the whole thing took us by surprise, because now that if you know what to look for, you can see it in the aerial photos. We weren't really sure what we were looking at. And so Omar Bradley, who's American ground commander, says it's the damnedest country I've ever seen. And it truly was. So anyway, so you combine that terrain and great defense by the tenacious Germans, and you end up with a stalled offensive. What I'm going to do is I'm going to skip across why was the Bocage so deadly. You can stop it later. The question we have is, so what? Conventional means of fighting don't work against that kind of system. You cannot get enough firepower to bear. The terrain prevents it. The German artillery is sighted everywhere. They're 88 millimeters, they're mortars, and you can't attack on a sizable front, which is what the Americans wanted to do. And the Americans find it hard to stay oriented. You don't know which way you're going. So what happens? It's called good old redneck ingenuity. Check out that tank. We got sandbags and this thing that looks like a dragon's tooth on it. It's a piece of angle iron or steel from the German defenses, and it can yank a hole into the hedgerow. And once it yanks that hole in there and backs it out, then you can pour in, or you can fire that 75 millimeter main gun or machine guns or everything else. And so that's what it's designed to do. And you get some new small unit tactics, and you plaster it with a whole bunch of artillery and mortar and anything else you can get your hands on. Bring in some airplanes. I mean, this is how we're going to have to deal with it. One of the examples, I mean, this is an assault team. You got a tank, you got an engineer with a satchel charge, which looks like a deadgum messenger bag filled with TNT or whatever it is. A squad of infantry, about 10 men, a Browning 30 cal and a 60 mil mortar, and you use it. Do it. The Sherman knocks the hole in. The engineer blows a bigger hole. The Sherman moves in and blows stuff up with white phosphorus, which is this nasty stuff that will burn through steel. Start popping out the machine gun. They start using that 75 millimeter, and you start lobbing in shells to pin them down. And then whoever's left alive, you open up on them with their infantry and the Sherman's machine gun. You wait for them to run off. You take a breath, you get a drink of water, and you do it again. So why does this become important? The obvious answer here, and I've got, is these tactics allow the American army to move through the Bocage and drive across France. We get through there, and it's going to be on. And we're going to see that here in just a minute. You look at individual and command initiative. I mean, unit commanders are expected to you're expected to get the job done. That's going to become important later on. With the results, July 17, something happens. July 17, the Germans had suffered 100,000 casualties. 2 weeks later, we, the Americans, had suffered 100,000. 85% of them in the infantry. And I'm going to give you one who's very important to me in a minute. 30,000 men out of that 100 are from mental disorders or combat fatigue. There's only so much your mind can take. We see that today in the Middle East. We saw it back then in France. We saw it back then in the Pacific, but they didn't know what they were seeing. All right? And so what happens is America begins to rely on massive and overwhelming firepower. We would rather throw 100,000 pounds of lead downrange than we would lose one man. And it's a little exaggeration, but not really. Okay? So that firepower and aggressive maneuver are going to be required to defeat this enemy. Here, this is a picture in there in one of the books on the 30th Infantry Division. And this man right here is incredibly interesting to me. I believe he's misidentified because this is the actual guy. And that is my great uncle Wilburn that's taken at my aunt's house. And he says, later I called for artillery to fire forward toward our front, where I thought the enemy was. After many rounds, I stopped it, not wanting to expose many more men to the enemy. I ordered Sergeant Byers and his squad of 4 or 5 men to penetrate beyond our lines to test the enemy after our artillery shelling quit. It was with great shock that word came that the enemy was still very much active and had opened up machine gun fire, killing Sergeant Byers. The rest of the squad made it back to safety. And that's how my great uncle died, and we didn't know this. My grandfather, who was an MP, who was nearby at the time, did not know how Uncle Wilburn died. And it took us 60-something years. And so these kind of stories play out all over America. Commanders do not want this kind of thing to happen, and they would rather put lead and steel downrange at a prodigious rate to keep it from happening. And Captain Smith, he was actually hit that same day, took a shot in the heel and had to be evacuated. It'd been a nasty little wound. And he ends up back in America. And that's why the family never found out. And for years, there was a rumor that Uncle Wilburn had been given a Purple Heart. And nobody had it. And about 2 years ago, one of my cousins, his mother, who basically had been the family historian, had passed away. And they found it in her effects. And he said, "You're named after him. You should have it." And so Uncle Wilburn's Purple Heart is in my house. And he's not on the Purple Heart registry because my great-grandmother, Georgia Byers, never sent the card in. I still have the card, too. So it's pretty cool when you sit down and think about it. I never met the man, neither has my father. But, 64 years later to figure out how he passed away, that's something else. Anyway, let's switch theaters again and Pacific and talk about a possibly useless but deadly battle, and that's the fight for Iwo Jima. I am recording this on November the 10th, and that is the anniversary of the Marine Corps, way back in the American Revolution. But this battle for Iwo is almost going to destroy the Marine Corps and end up in its dissolution. And that's kind of a strange thing, the way the Marine Corps celebrates this battle. And Iwo Jima literally means Sulphur Island. And it's 3,000 miles, or the width of the United States, away from Pearl Harbor. And it's less than 700 miles south of Japan. This is in their backyard. And the thing's not big. It's only 5 miles in length and 2 miles in width. It's not a big island. And on the southern end of it, as you can see, that's Mount Suribachi that looks like somebody's cake that fell in right there. And it's 500 feet tall. I mean, that's pretty good sized. And Japan's claimed this as a home island since about 1861 or so, about the time of the American Civil War. And one Japanese officer said it is a waterless island of sulfur springs where neither swallows nor sparrows flew. It's a hole, people. It is a nasty hole of volcanic dirt. It ain't even dirt. It's more like heavy ash. In memory, we like to see this picture here, from flags of our fathers, the men who raised that flag on Mount Suribachi and in their lives afterward. And it has embodied, in a lot of ways, a sacrifice of the war. If you go to Washington, D.C. and go to the Marine Corps Memorial, it's this picture right here. That is the Iwo Jima is their memorial. But the thing is, it probably doesn't need to be that. And I hate to say it that way, but when you start looking at it, it's been as important as we wanted it to be until the very end of the war, the very last days, when we start dropping those nuclear devices. But so the question is, was it important? And it depends on the point of view. And it depends on when the account's written. I mean, you look at the old school idea. This place to land these damaged B-29s. You see the pride of the Yankees there. And it's a fighter strips they can escort, and loiter over Japan longer. And, some people say it was critical to the staging of an invasion of Japan, which was planned for later. So when you start looking at newer scholarship and some new interpretations, it boils down to Ernie King, who was the overall commander of the Navy, and George Marshall, who's the overall commander of the Army, and Chester Nimitz, who's the commander of the Pacific Navy, and MacArthur, who was in charge of the Army in the Pacific. And it's a fight over who is going to be in charge of the invasion of Japan, and everybody wants to be the one. And so the one of the interpretations is that Nimitz and King said, you know what, watch it. We'll show you how to do it. Let's just take this home island of Japan. And it almost broke the Marines' back. Okay, so we're the ones that know how to do amphibious operations, not you bunch of Army pukes. Yeah. You had a little fun over in Sicily and over with D-Day, but we're going to show you how to do it. And it almost ruins the Marine Corps as a fighting force and ends in its dissolution. So look at what's the plan. That is the USS Tennessee there. Yeah, that's Tennessee cranking out, lobbing shells onto this thing. And it's supposed to be short, and it's supposed to be sweet. It's supposed to be about a week and a half, 2 weeks if at the most. Shoo. We're going to have this shore bombardment. It is going to precede the invasion. We're going to knock anything down on that island. We're going to blow up every bunker we can get our hands on. We're going to bomb this thing out of existence. And then we're going to turn these ships around and we're going to go over to what's Okinawa, where we're going to show you how to do that too, which is a combined Army and Marine Corps battle. But the Navy, what it does is it decides it's going to back out of most of the bombardment. And they're going to be like, okay, what we're going to do, we're not going to waste all these shells, not going to waste all this stuff. We know what's coming. It ain't going to be a big deal, dealing with this island. But we are going to send 3 Marine divisions because guess what? This is going to be overkill, and we'll have it done in no time. Not so fast like the old Lee Corso thing. Japanese commander, he has no expectation of success at all. He knows nobody's coming to save him. It's just idea we're going to fight to the last man. Everybody's pressed into service as infantry, cooks, and mechanics, and everything else. And what they did is they dig these bunkers into hills, and they expand caves, and they dig them underground, and it is an absolute mess. And they put heavy timber over it, and they cover it with brush, and they cover it with camouflage, and you can't see it. My God, they could have one of these things pop up behind you, and out come 50 screaming Japanese, and you didn't know they were there. And that defense in depth is going to test the mettle of the Marine Corps. So when the Marines carry about 50 pounds of equipment and maybe 100 pounds of weapons, equipment, ammunition, that's like a whole person almost. Clothing, helmet, backpack, trenching tool, poncho, rations, cigarettes, cleaning kit, gas mask, cartridge belt, knife, grenades, rifle or carbine, and ammunition. Folks, these are not big men. I'm like 6'2", 246 this morning when I weighed or something crazy like that. These guys are going to, the most part, going to be well under 6 feet. They're going to be 5'10", about 150 pounds. So look at what they're carrying. They're carrying almost their entire body weight in stuff. And by the way, we're going to fight. We're going to hit that beach. And the Japanese figured out long ago, don't try to hit them on the beach. Don't do it Erwin Rommel style. Wait till they get inland, and then we're going to open up on them. And so the minute they start to get off that black sulfur beach, then the machine guns open up, then the mortars open up, then the artillery opens up, and then the slaughter starts. The Japanese had at least 361 artillery pieces lined up on that beachhead. Folks, it's going to be a slaughter. And so all of a sudden everybody's like, what in the heck? the Japanese doing? They're fighting that defense in depth. Every rock, every tree, every bit of ground. 1,500 tunnels dug 75 feet below ground. Some of them you can't bomb it out. You can't use a battleship and knock it out. That artillery would roll out, shoot a couple rounds, whoosh, roll back in, and go somewhere else. You're looking at that by that nightfall on February 19th. 30,000 Marines are ashore, but 566 killed, probably times 3, times 4 wounded. And you look at that perimeter, 1,100 yards deep by approximately 2 miles wide. The Marines have a toehold on this island, and every Marine was trying to dig himself in for protection. You can't dig in this volcanic soil. I'm going to show it to you in the next slide. You see a little bit here. But some of the vignettes from this battle are so very important. Arthur Rodriguez was a corpsman, so his job is to run out and help men that have been hit. And you know, the corpsman asked him to hold a man's intestines in while he put sulfur powder on him, while he pushed him back in. Can you imagine? I mean, that's just unreal. You know, Rodriguez, I saw my group leader sitting there with his left arm dangling by the skin. He just grabbed it with his right and pulled it off and threw it away. The shock that would set in, and he did not feel that pain with adrenaline pumping, but he's ripped his own arm off. Or look at what Joey Copeland says. God, if you save my life, I'll go to church every Sunday and never miss. I mean, Gerald Linderman's The World Within War is a great look at some of these bargains and the way men saw this combat, but it is that brutal. So the only thing to do is to move forward. If you stay there, you're going to die. And that's the sole tactical option, bunker by bunker, foot by foot, one foot in front of the other. And the Japanese are looking down on you from Mount Suribachi the whole time, so they know where you're at and what you're doing. And so no matter how many times the Marines attacked, they lost steam after a couple of 100 yards because they're taking casualties the likes of which we have not seen in America. But again, what are you going to do? If you stay there, you're going to die. If you move forward, you're going to die. So you may as well move forward, because otherwise we're not going to take this island. And the enemy itself was virtually invisible. I mean, you look at that right there. Imagine that from 100 yards away. You see that the logs in front of that pillbox. You can't see it. All right? It takes 5 days to take Suribachi. And we think, oh, raise the flag, that's the end of it. No. You see the John Wayne film Sands of Iwo Jima, and it looks that way. Or even Flags of Our Father, even parts of the miniseries The Pacific. But what happens? There are still 20,000 Japanese dug into the north. Even though you got Suribachi, there's 20,000 Japanese shooting at you. And so what happens is you get men who are exposed, Americans that are exposed, they're getting shot. You can't find the Japanese to shoot at night. They have the suicidal banzai charges jumping up from behind you, from among you. It is unreal. And Arthur Rodriguez tells us again, he said, we've not seen enemy to shoot at. It made us frustrated and angry because we had nothing to show for our casualties. It is awful. I mean, if you want to defend an island, the way the Japanese did it, and you don't care, it's baffled. So what are the effects? Again, we told you 3 days in combat. Imagine being on Iwo. That combat fatigue, those cases mount, and they mount fast. And some guys think the only way we're going to get out here is to get wounded or to get killed. And so there's frustration, there's lowered morale. They just want to get done. The Japanese, for their part, though we don't have many accounts, obviously, because the vast majority, and I'm talking the vast majority, are going to end up dying. They're hungry, they're thirsty, they're living underground. We do know from diaries that their morale plummeted. They knew they were going to die, so how many Marines can we take with us? And so this is a recipe for slaughter. But Iwo teaches us some lessons. And it's not anything from a tactical or strategic sense. It's from the lesson of war that we're going to defeat the Japanese on their home turf. We're going to have to do it in close quarters combat. It's not going to be, let's lob some artillery, let's get some planes, let's get some tanks, let's roll a battleship up and shoot them at point blank. That ain't how you're going to do it. You're going to go toe-to-toe, cave to cave. All right? And I've got on here that it's Japan's best conducted defensive operation in the war. I believe it is. It and in Okinawa show us that invading Japan is going to suck. And so you've got to put that into the equation when we talk about the atomic bomb. Okay? So when Truman has this option to drop this new weapon on the Japanese, the memory of Iwo and I call it its sister Okinawa, are so fresh that they're like, there is no way we're doing that. One Marine for every Japanese that was killed. We had not seen anything like that. Not Guadalajara, not in the Philippines, not Tarawa, not Saipan, none of it. Not Peleliu, as brutal as Peleliu was. We haven't. 6,800 Marines, 363 sailors are going to die, 17,000 and change were wounded. You stood a 1 out of 3 chance of being a casualty if you were sent to Iwo Jima. But you look at the Japanese, had 21,000 of them on that island, and all but about 200 ended up dying. So Iwo Jima was an incredible cost. So what do we get out of all of this? World War II is going to be bloody, and it's going to be nasty. It's going to be 400 and some odd thousand Americans going to be killed, including my great uncle Wilburn. The end of that war, though, is going to see the ascendancy of an America that's come out of the Great Depression and has come out of it like a phoenix rising from the ashes. But there's going to be some other problems. We're going to use 2 atomic bombs to end it. And that's like trying to put the toothpaste back in the tube, or put the genie back in the bottle, or whatever other analogy you want to use. So that's going to create some problems. We've got allies in Great Britain who is incredibly weak. You got France now who's, whatever, they're back. You've got the Soviet Union that has been so incredibly suspicious of us that now, almost in the minute the guns stop, they're no longer an ally. There's a suspicion that leads them to become an enemy. And so we're going to have to deal with all of that as a result of this war. You had 14 million Americans under arms, and they're going to come back, and they want jobs, and they want things to do, and they want stuff to buy. So what is that going to do to the economy? And so that's some questions that must be asked and must be answered. And we'll do that here in a little while as we get into the Cold War and the American home front in the post-war era. Biography with this, because there's some incredible books. A lot of these from my World War II in the Pacific Theater class. And World War II seminar from grad school, not undergrad. Rick Atkinson's The Day of Battle, his Guns at Last Light, his Army at Dawn. Those 3 are incredible. Robert Burrell's The Ghost of Iwo Jima is a great look at Iwo Jima and whether or not it was worth anything. The second half of the book talks a great deal about the political machinations that almost ended with the dissolution of the Marines. Michael Dublair's Closing with the Enemy is fantastic. Shiyoshi Hasegawa is not my favorite person. His Racing with the Enemy, he makes the point that the Japanese wanted to surrender to the Russians. I think I don't know that he's right, but that's okay. That's what history's all about. It's pretty fun. Max Hastings' Retribution there is a good old school look at why does America firebomb Japan. And if you don't like that one, there's one called Flyboys by James Bradley that is much more readable text. His father was the corpsman on the flag raising ceremony on Suribachi, but he goes into some incredible detail about how the Japanese trained and what it was like to be in Tokyo during the firebombing. It's just really good work. And then there Marvin Smith's between the hedgerows. It's a really cool read. It's almost like I can be with my grandfather and my great uncle through this. And that description of Uncle Wilburn has been in several books since then, so it's pretty cool to see. But anyway, we'll pick it up again one day. Thank you so much.